Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to launch this season of our monthly campfires. So the monthly campfire is really a great opportunity for people to share their ideas, their projects, and get a bit of feedback or just a great conversation with people who share their interests. My name is Philippe Bourdieu-Brassard. I am the co-president of the Archipelago of Design and professor at Canadian Forest College. The Archipelago of Design is, I would say, the leading independent network bringing mostly service members, national security professionals, academics, researchers, and instructors from across NATO members and partners who are really interested in empowering their colleagues and their teams with systems thinking, critical thinking, foresight, and design theory. And the best way we found to do this recently is by developing a transformative game called Breakthrough. And since then, we really embarked on this transformative strategy game agenda. We have tons of projects in the pipeline. And as part of this agenda, we have two main components that are essential. The first one is network. We do nothing alone. Every time we do a new project, we do it by co-designing with anybody who might be interested. And also, we want to learn as much as possible from other game designers. And that's why I'm so happy that Scott volunteered to start this season today. I met Scott at the Connection North conference in June, and really his speech was a total blast on disinformation and how do you design a game for sensibilizing on disinformation. So I'm glad that now he's going to offer a more extended version of this talk today. But who is he? Scott is beyond being a wonderful human being, of course. He is a Ph.D. candidate and researcher at Concordia's Communication Studies department in Montreal, my dear Montreal. It's still better than Toronto, but I'm trying to get Toronto. And he is also a game designer of many upcoming games, but Blizzard and Lies, which is his magnum opus on disinformation. And he's really interested in comparing different, let's say, mediums to learn traditional learning methods versus games, for instance. And I just learned that also Scott is also a cook and really like to bake cookies. So perhaps the next game could be about how to learn to bake the best cookies ever. So again, it's a real pleasure to have you, Scott. And lastly, before we go, we have a little honor code at AOD. I think we are such a diverse community, and usually people in this community don't hesitate to share their very strong opinions. So I expect that you will do so. I expect that you will radically disagree, but please do remain respectful. We will not tolerate any form of disrespect during this chat or after, or even on our online platforms. So thank you so much. Scott, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. And as I said before, thank you everyone for being here. I'm just going to share my screen because as is tradition on online things, we're going to do a lovely PowerPoint. But hopefully, as Philippe mentioned, we can make it, even though it's about disinformation, not be overly boring and bland and dry. So hi, today I'm going to talk about how we can make disinformation tangible through games. And I use the word tangible to just mean like how we can feel it, we can interact with it, and we can make sense of it through systems design. As Philippe kindly mentioned, my name is Scott DeJong. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at Concordia University, but I thought I would give some context a little bit more for who I am and where I am in the work that I do. So I actually started as a primary junior educator. So I got my degree in Ontario. I was working in kindergarten to grade 6 classrooms, and I saw a lot of students come into classrooms with disinformation that they had learned from their parents' social media, and there were not a lot of tools to look at that. And I was like, well, let's pursue a media studies degree to try to figure that out, which is what I did. And then in that, I realized there's also not a lot of tools from the academic side to understand how disinformation functions beyond like the research data approaches, but in terms of simulation and modeling, not a lot exists. And so that's what I continued studying in my communications PhD that I'm at today. I've also been a public scholar on media literacy in Canada as well as play design, and I'd also consider myself an educational game designer. If you're interested, I'm also a researcher at these various institutions, which range from studying AI to studying seniors in Canada, as well as technoculture and art. I'm happy to follow up on anything if you have questions about the talk today or just about the things that I do. So as I said before, I study how to make digital issues tangible, and I use games as a way to do so. So some of the other games that I've done, which I'm not going to go in depth today, is I started actually designing in escape rooms, which for the unfamiliar are themed puzzle rooms where you put in a group of players and they have to solve different puzzles or clues in order to get to a solution. So the game on the left side of the screen, that was a game that talked about older adult mistreatment as well as scams, and it was an escape room that talked about that and is very serious in tone. And the one on the right talked about echo chambers, filter bumbles, and how platforms kind of drive content to users. And so this is kind of the background for the work that I've been doing that kind of brings me to where I am today. And today I'm going to talk about the board game that Philippe mentioned, which is called Lizards and Lies, which is a board game that models how conspiracy theory and disinformation move through social media networks. But because we have some time today, I'm going to kind of break down the basics of my design process for getting there, the process on how I actually designed digital content into a game, and then I'm going to run through, if we have some time and people are looking interested in it, the actual like quick gameplay of how the game functions and how that relates to everything else we've talked about. So that's the basic plan. So I like to start what I'm going to do. Well, perhaps you have the most attention, whereas I don't know how much attention you'll have at the end. And so I thought I'd offer the three kind of core learning points of the work that I've been doing in the design space. So the first is that disinformation is inherently playful. And what I mean from that is that when we look at disinformation content, the way that people troll or they target different user groups or the way that it moves through networks in non-traditional ways is very similar to playful mechanics. And I'll break that down in a little bit. Additionally, when we're designing these systems, we're not designing conflict like traditional war games, but we're designing what I'm referring to as gray ecosystems, or ecosystems where the actors' roles can shift from being good to bad or anything in between. And good and bad, again, is morally weighted. It's a whole other can of worms. And finally, even though disinformation refers to content, when we're designing games for disinformation, the focus is actually not on content. It's not on the fake news articles, but it's on the systems and interactions that engage there. So I'm going to break these all down as we go, but I thought I would offer these as a purview to what's to come. So mentioned before, Lizards and Lies, I'll give the brief summary now and we'll deep dive into it in a little bit, but it's a 2v2 board game where you either spread conspiracy theory or stop the spread of conspiracy theory. So you're going to play as one of four actors in social media, and you're going to have some cards and some tokens, and you're going to influence a social media network by trying to spread lies about a certain political election or try to maintain facts and truth in that same time. The game can be played by one or one players, and it's been showcased in different schools, different undergraduate classrooms. I've worked with different militaries, such as those in Lithuania and in Canada, as well as in Sicily, on implementing the game in those spaces. And I've also presented on it in multiple different venues. So we're going to get into the basics of the design process and disinformation as a whole. So first up, when I talk about designing, I like to give a purview for how I design or what I'm thinking about design when I'm thinking about simulation. So I combine these three themes as like the core tenets of my design process, which is wargaming and foresight, which I think this group here is probably the most familiar with, but just in case, I'll generally summarize it as how do we simulate theories and concepts, and how do we kind of apply the future perspectives of what we're playing out. And then when I say play, I'm focusing on kind of how we make the interactions of games over the systems. I prioritize how me playing with the board or me playing with other players influences what I'm trying to simulate and or teach over what the board itself is able to teach, because I believe that it's more important that the players themselves can enact it than the system, because sometimes players will play games weird and different, and that's cool too. And finally, conversation. One of the reasons I love analog games is because they allow you to talk. They increase that kind of engagement, and it's a really powerful thing that designers should keep in mind as they're going. So I'll break these down a little bit more. When I'm talking about wargaming and foresight, and for those in this field, I know that you know there's probably more depth than what is here, but the very simple is we can explore possibilities, we can train and prepare people, and we can generate policy directions if we're looking at the foresight world. And if I kind of boil these down, is we can either focus, when people are doing these processes, if we're looking at what's being done, we can either focus on digital spaces, such as social media, like Lizards and Lies does, or you can focus on cyber. And for those who are in the wargaming military space, cyber gaming is a growing area, and it's slightly different in how they view disinformation in the work that they're doing, right? So this is an IBM security war game. It's just an image of it. And a lot of cyber games focus on like defense lines and protecting kind of servers, and like companies even will run like IBM, they will run these war games as like we're protecting our data and our storage systems. And governments have their own processes for cyber gaming as well, especially during times of conflict where cyber is a very important side of military events. These games are important, but in the context of disinformation, disinformation is typically like an addendum to cyber games that I've looked at, as opposed to kind of the core focus, where disinformation is like a concern, but it's not always the main threat, where the threat is larger concerns of national security and data pieces. Then on the other side, we have the disinformation social media spaces, which typically fall into the world of education. This is a game called Agents of Influence, which is still TBD. They haven't officially announced the release, but there's been some literature on it, which I think is interesting. But what they do in these games is they simulate social media environments, and they do that in order to talk to people about how do we actually act in these spaces? How do these social cultural interactions occur, right? So how do different communities form? And then those communities have certain logics and ideas that drive their interaction. So these are the kind of two spaces that I find exist in the wargaming foresight world, though this second digital stuff also bleeds into the space of education. And so if I'm trying to show like the difference between the cyber gaming and the disinformation gaming that I position myself in, is that cyber gaming is typically more network focused, it's typically more event or scenario focused, and its audience is most commonly organizations, so whether that be militaries or governments or companies. From the disinformation field, a lot of the products that have been done are typically focused on like community defense, or the idea of resilience, where you're trying to train up citizens because they're the ones on the front lines, and that is also who your audience is. So the audience and stakeholders vary in these two spaces. And then I mentioned before that I'm designing for play, and I love just Googling play and then looking at the images every time, which is why I included some of these ones here. Because it's always funny when we talk about like what do we mean by play and what is play, right? We have sports, we have like the child playing with like blocks or cars, and then you have like the facilitated gameplay sessions. And for me, the difference is just thinking about play versus games or systems versus interaction, right? So I love this image of chess where you have, traditional chess set up, and then you have the interaction with chess where someone, combines all the pieces into this massive dominating king, and the nature of the game is completely different, right? And it's what I'm getting at here is that when people play a game, they will interpret the system how they want to in some capacity. Like, yes, rules can influence how players play the game, but their own interactions, especially if rules are like long and convoluted, can be just interpreted by the players. And while this is a bit of an extreme example where the average person who doesn't know how to play chess probably won't make this king god piece, there is still a need to consider how are we interacting more than how is the system telling us to interact, because at the end of the day, how players interpret that system is more important for how you think about your design. And finally, conversation. I included Twister because it's just my favorite game of all time, which I know is weird, but that's an aside. But when you're playing Twister, you're always talking, or you're always laughing, or you're always interacting. And so it's a really good example of kind of that idea of conversation. But the cream of the crop in terms of conversation would be D&D, right? Or tabletop role-playing games, where when you have people sitting around a table and they're telling stories together, they are creating narratives, but they're also talking about their own lives, their own interactions, how they see the world versus how their character sees the role. And there's a lot of space for growth and just dissecting what's happening there. Matrix games, if you're familiar with wargaming, do a similar practice in terms of having people have very low stakes kind of engagement and then being able to talk and engage with those pieces of content. So that's kind of the design space basics that I wanted to cover. I'm going to move into what I mean by disinformation. And I think this gets to the meat of how we think about design. So we're probably all familiar with disinformation as something that has come across our feeds or life or something in capacity. These are the common definitions that I see cited or used when we talk about disinformation. And you'll notice I highlighted intentionally the similarities between these definitions so you can understand the key kind of piece that they all get at, which is that it's content that is deliberate, it's false, and it's intentional, and its intent is typically harmful. And we see that from NATO, we see that from the UN, we see that from academics. It's all in that space. And these approaches, they're helpful because they help us understand what to look for when we say false content, because they're trying to separate it from other types of content online, but the lines get really gray. Like when we talk about scams, they're harmful and they're deliberate, but people wouldn't always consider them disinformation. Or in some cases, we can talk about content that is not deliberately false for who's sharing it. So if we think about like alt-left or alt-right communities, people might find content that they believe is true, and they're not intentionally trying to spread fake news. They're trying to share what they think is the actual truth. Right. That's why you have a lot of people talking about truth seekers and sleepwalkers and that kind of rhetoric and language, because for some of them, they know that they're spreading lies. And for others, they think that that is the ideal in the world that they're in. And so what I always remind people or think about is that disinformation is not just those smoking guns. We have the data, we have the research, we know that disinformation is out there. I can show you countless studies on Twitter and other social media platforms that show that disinformation exists. But the content, the fake news article, doesn't matter if no one engages with it. The disinformation doesn't matter if no one is spreading it, talking about it, reading it, or posting it again. What matters is how it connects to the users and the communities that are there. And so what we need to focus on is how it's personal, how it's felt, and how it's experienced. And what I talk about is disinformation is a system that ties into our worldviews. And I think that's a more important way to think about the concept as we go in it. So if I'm kind of providing I don't want to provide a full definition because definitions are stoked in their own sense of interpretation, but the kind of keywords for design that I think about when I'm discussing disinformation is that it's interactive. We need people to engage with it. It's community forming. So the type of disinformation that's posted will then kind of set the boundaries for what's okay or not okay in communities. It's targeted. When disinformation is trying to be propagated, it's targeting specific groups or audiences and what it's trying to do. And it's ideological. It's that idea that it sounds about right. It fits with the worldviews and the belief systems that people have. And so just some examples on like the playful side of things. This is a photo to talk about QAnon. I don't want to go into too much detail about QAnon. If you're fascinated by conspiracy theories and you haven't heard about the US Capitol riots, perhaps take a look at QAnon. But it's a conspiracy theory that talks about deep state politics, pedophiles within the US government, and extends into kind of the idea of global cabals and elites. But the point that I'm getting at is that it's a really good example of the playfulness of disinformation, because how a lot of QAnon started was you had message boards online where a user or a few users would post what was called a Q drop, which is like a cryptic clue that then other forum users would go unpack, and in their unpacking they would discover, this conspiracy about the state. And that is very similar to how you would design puzzle games based off my experience in escape rooms, but also as other game designers have written, some even comparing QAnon to alternate reality games, which try to weave this kind of darker web underneath our space. This is an example from the research that I do where I look at disinformation within the Canadian right and left. This is a meme that was posted in January by a Facebook group called Canada Proud, which is apparently a nonprofit, but we have data and proof that shows that they're deeply funded by very particular political pundits. But that's not the point here. Is they posted this image of Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, sitting on a plane, and obviously you can tell this is photoshopped. In case you couldn't tell this is photoshopped, this is photoshopped. However, if you actually break down the image even more, the people in the bottom half, which this image is saying are Canadians stranded in the Caribbean, it's actually an image from a BBC article 2 years prior of individuals stranded in the summer heat in an airport in the UK. So these are not even Canadian. Well, some of them might be Canadian citizens, but most of them are probably not Canadian citizens. They're not in the Caribbean. And the argument being made here is already misconstrued and misleading. When you break down what they're actually trying to say in their comment as Canadians remain stranded, this was a piece that barely hit the news cycle, and the only groups that really shared it were the Conservative Party of Canada and other right-wing kind of political groups. And it was clearly meant to kind of be a way to just dig at Trudeau, which is, that's politics. That's fine. But what this meme is doing is it's creating that boundary line of the community. They want people to not like Trudeau because that would help promote people not voting for him again, which makes sense. But they're misconstruing the data and the images and what's happening in order to do that, right? And even though in the comment sections you have people being like, "Oh, it's okay that he's like flying his jet," no one's actually attacking the fact that like the misleading image that exists beyond the fact that he's photoshopped on a plane, but that this issue of Canadians stranded in the Caribbean isn't really true. It was a handful of families from Quebec who ended up getting a flight out the next day, and it was 24 hours that they're in the Caribbean. So it's one of those pieces where, yes, this is like that line of gray of disinformation in the sense of there's false news here, but it's portrayed in a way that's meant to be satirical or already misleading. So there's weird boundary lines of how we define it, but what it's really doing is it's maintaining a community kind of perspective and ideology on the prime minister. And I'm not here to defend Trudeau's actions or anything. I'm just showing this as an example of kind of the rhetoric being used in the data that I have. And so the current solution that we have to disinformation from the worlds that I'm in is looking at media literacy, right? Because disinformation is something that impacts the public. And so media literacy is a solution of, well, let's train the public how to interpret the information they see online, and hopefully they will be able to dissect it for themselves and be critical thinkers. That's like the dream. It doesn't really always work out that way, but there are games that are trying to do that. And so I actually thought, so I'm not talking the whole time, we could take like 5 or 10 minutes to just play some of these very simple media literacy games that exist, because these are very simple models of how people who are not in the wargaming space but in the education space are trying to embed disinformation into games. So I have 2 games here that you're welcome to load up in a browser. I'm going to load up one and just have it on the screen for those of you who might have tech issues doing so. But if you just Google Harmony Square game or you Google Troll Factory game, you will find either of these games. Troll Factory, just as a warning, uses real world extremist content in the game. So if you're not wanting to see that today, perhaps don't play that one today. If you want to see something a bit more happy-go-lucky, look at Harmony Square. They talk about pineapples on pizzas as divisive content. So I thought it would be helpful to kind of look at these 2 titles, because that's a lot of what my background work did to look at the media literacy side. And then I'll move forward into talking about designing in the wargaming space and the differences between what was done there. So I'm going to swap my screen over. So if you haven't Googled one of these yet, to just give like a 5 to 10 minute playthrough, do so now, and I'll just pull up Harmony Square and do a quick little walkthrough of the game just now, just to kind of break up my voice and presentation a little bit. So I think you can see Harmony Square on my screen. Philippe, if you have a thumbs up that you can see this game now as opposed to my fantastic. So I'm just going to walk through this game. We're going to just play it for like 5 to 10 minutes, just making sure we're okay for time, which we are. So this game is split into 4 chapters, and as you can tell, it's like a narrative adventure game. If you're playing your own game, feel free to mute me. You don't have to listen to me talk over you trying to play a game. But they start with this story of like, you're hired, and you're like, hired as what? And they tell you that you are a disinformation officer. So it's playing into this world of you being the spreader. I'm not going to answer their academic questions because of the nature of what we're doing right here. And then you get to choose a code name, right? And so they give you some choices to make your character. The names are funny, so we'll pick one and go with it. And it invites you to kind of start sowing chaos as the villains in this social media space. And so in this case, Harmony Square is meant to not get too political or too intensive. So they do use kind of like an annual pineapple pizza festival as kind of like an initial starting point for sowing dissent. And it has this ticker at the top to let you see kind of the headlines that are happening, and it's broken down into 4 chapters, each related to a different theme of disinformation and how it spreads. And your goal is to get a lot of likes and content. So it's like a very simple choose your own adventure game that we have here. How do we start? It seems well, but let's check the local news. So we get to choose some headlines. Talking about a swan escaping, denying a permit, renovating artwork. I think we'll go with the swan and go from there. So we can kidnap the swan or turn it into a heated debate. I'm always a fan of kidnapping a swan. But they're not actually going to let you do it because that's how choices work in narrative games sometimes. And so instead, we're going to spread some things online. And it gives you choices to write different posts, which are representative of social media posts. Most commonly, these games refer to Twitter, though that's because they were made before X, and I don't know if that's going to be the case with the games that I see moving forward. And then it has language in here that can be referenced and taught about in terms of like emotional language or visceral language as ways to kind of teach this kind of content. And it's meant to show kind of that social media ecosystem that you're building up. So if you are playing a game on your own time, we're going to just do it for like 2 more minutes. I'm just going to click through for a little bit and perhaps just let people read. So I'll just take time as opposed to talking and filling the air, because I'll be talking for the next bit anyways. So that's been about 7 minutes since I was like, let's go play a game. So you've probably established the core gameplay loop, right? Which is clicking, choosing posts, and putting content in. And if you are interested in these kind of games, I have a list of, I think, close to 57 games now. Is the PowerPoint back? I think I shared the right thing. Yeah. Okay. Cool. 57 games now, which I've done analysis on, and I'll very briefly kind of show. So, this data is from January when I'd only had about 33 games, 28 games. And I played as many of them as I could, and kind of looked at what were the main themes being done here. And as you can tell from these 2 graphs that try to make me look like I know what I'm doing, is there's a lot of quiz games and a lot of narrative adventure games, which means that they're following into the same themes of, at the end of the day, the game is the instructor, and it's just telling you what to do. And the narratives are funny and they're nicely put together, and that's not like a bad thing, but there isn't actually a lot of space for interaction and engagement, which is when I was saying at the very start that I'm trying to make disinformation tangible. These games kind of struggle to do so. They make a very great replacement for a teacher if you want to run like a small activity to get the basics of like what is disinfo, but they can struggle to kind of let people actually interact with those systems and see how actions lead to content moving. And so what I talk about is that media literacy needs to adapt to kind of the modern needs, where it's not just content, which these games focus on, but rather the communities of interaction that start to form. And so there's a need to kind of move past some of these systems, and that's where wargaming and foresight and board game design can actually really open up some interesting avenues to complement the work being done in these media literacy spaces. So I'm going to talk about my design process for Lizards and Lies, and then we're going to move into some gameplay of it, and then I'll try to answer questions whenever there's like a pause that I can in the chat, but please feel free to ask as many as you want after as well. So the gameplay process. of designing the game. So theory into play was the clear goal. So it was, how do we take information pipelines and how content moves online and design that into a game? How do we talk about distributed discovery? So the idea that content will just appear on news feeds, that algorithms will promote it in different ways, that it will go cross platforms. How do people find news, and how does news find us? How do we put that into a game? And finally, this notion of the swarm, which has been talked about in relationship to disinformation, is the idea that whenever there's like a disinformation event, it bubbles up and it swarms and swarms and swarms. And then, it gets disproven, so it will recede back down. And then another event will happen, it will bubble up and bubble up and bubble up again. And then it will get disproven and it will recede and recede, recede. And every single time you have that bubbling up and going back down, a few people will hang on to what went up. So every single time it bubbles up, it doesn't go back down as far, and it will keep going up and up. So eventually what happens is you get this kind of overflow, which leads into, larger mass movements or events, because people eventually are so baked into these communities and spaces. And that's how these kind of disinformation moments that really cause a lot of concern can occur, is because each time a little disinformation article gets some breadth, it's a ripple in that wave that then builds up to a larger swarm. So the basic method, for those familiar with designing in these spaces, this is probably not going to be too much of a shocking approach. In the academic world, I refer to my approach as a mixture of research creation and simulation design. What that simply means is that I'm using creative research practices as opposed to data scraping on Twitter. What I'm doing is I'm using game design as an actual method alongside simulation design, which has a long history of in the spaces that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, of designing war games and designing models and systems, to kind of model theory. And what I'm trying to model is communications and disinformation theory into games. So my process goes, I research the topic, I simulate the topic, I then iterate on the simulation, and I repeat. And so Lizards and Lies has occurred over the course of about a year and a half, where I was researching far right and far left partisan groups within Canada and trying to put that into a game. It ended up focusing on conspiracy theory in the end, because that's typically easier for the average player to digest than talking about Canadian politics in a game itself. And so how do we actually visualize digital systems? That's the actual question that we get to when we're talking about designing these games. In academia, we have some approaches. As you can see on the left, this is like a network map that you'll see sometimes in academic papers, where it's supposed to show kind of the pathways of interconnection between communities and Twitter users or groups. And on the right, we have more of like an artist's rendition or graphic designer's rendition of the internet, which is like these different bubbles, with some being bigger because more people are there and some being smaller. And so these are some ways that we can model it, but how do we turn these into actual boards? And so you're going to see the very, very early versions of Lizards and Lies, which on the left here was designed during a pandemic, which I'm sure you've all heard about. And so therefore it was designed in Roll20, which is like an online tabletop software, where if you kind of look back, right, we're trying to reflect those channels and networks to communities. So the one on the left, you see like Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit, and then you have like 4chan and 8kun at the bottom, which are, again, we're simplifying and boiling down how these systems and networks function, because the point here isn't to have a perfect model of the internet, because that is literally impossible. But you have a model that when we engage with it can reflect how these networks function. So eventually this place-based iteration became a little bit prettier and a little bit more cohesive into kind of these nodes and communities that are connecting them. Eventually, this turned into kind of playable iterations and prototypes into the final version we have today. And if I go back to like the first one, it's this idea of like 4chan, 8kun kind of infiltrating, the larger social medias, which still kind of sits in the final one today. But design moved away from that actual model where disinformation or conspiracy can pop up throughout the system. And I'll break that down a bit more as we go. So throughout the design process, I looked at playable characters. And I mentioned before, the game has people trying to spread disinformation and those trying to remove the spread or remove the disinformation that's there. And so the blue are the people trying to remove it, and the red are people trying to spread it. And these rules are a bit fluid in the sense of like what they're doing is very different. But these are the different actors that were play tested. So we had fact checkers, educators, and moderators kind of playing against conspiracy theorists, edgelords or trolls, and then like content recommending algorithms. This changed in design, so at the end of the day, the game itself is trolls and conspiracy theorists and educators and moderators. But if you're interested in kind of why certain were kept and certain were lost, I'm happy to explain that in more depth later. So the research project that I engaged in that started this board game was asking, can I actually use games to visualize or simulate the idea of a disinformation war, which is a term that's been thrown out since disinformation kind of reappeared in the public imaginary in the 2010s, where you saw people referring to it as an information war, disinformation war, or like disinformation conflicts. And what you see in this kind of space is discussions of battle lines, sites of conflict, like, oh, this is happening all over, 4chan, or it's, being conceived of there. Soldiers, such as who are those people, those actors mentioned before, and what is the end result, right? So there's like a victory condition. How do we win the disinformation war? Can we even win the disinformation war is the question that I think is more important to be asking. And so that was what initial design was built around, where you had kind of more traditional wargaming approaches where I had my red teams and my blue teams, and I had like, okay, we're going to try to like influence Facebook here, and then Facebook's going to push back. And it didn't really work out. The idea of total domination it was really unrealistic and unsatisfying. So it's really rare that all of social media is dominated by a disinformation campaign. Yet if you're doing a territory control style game, that's what it's supposed to feel like. And so playing into that didn't actually match what disinformation networks do, where they're happy to just convince like the majority of people in these Facebook groups that they are right, or they're just happy to get anyone to hang on to. And additionally, conspiracy doesn't care about battle lines. Like, it doesn't care if you go and remove its content with fact checking. It's just going to twist the story and post it somewhere else. Like, if Twitter flags it, oh great, it's going to go post it on Reddit. If Reddit flags it, it's going to go post it on Instagram. Like, it doesn't really care about like the trench warfare or battle lines that you see sometimes driven up in wargaming design. And so from there, I shifted from wargaming approaches specifically to kind of a more models and simulation approach, and looked at kind of the analogy of the infodemic. So I went from the analogy of the disinformation war to more of this viral model, which during COVID was the popular kind of analogy being touted, especially with the World Health Organization legitimately using those terms. So the idea of battle lines became viral pathways. How does it kind of move through these pipelines? The sites of conflict became the zones of infection. So which communities are more vulnerable to disinformation content? The soldiers moved into like the frontline defenders. So who are the people actually fact checking and responding? And finally, instead of having like a one war, it's like, can we, vaccinate or create a solution to remove this information content? So this was like the transition that the game took. Oh, well, that's fine. Going from war to virality. However, such a model also kind of fell flat or struggled to really demonstrate how these theories and concepts work. The idea of vaccination, the idea of like a one solution victory, is unrealistic because disinformation is something we would refer to as subversive. It's consistently shifting and changing how it interacts. And so to have a single win condition of you have successfully removed all the disinformation or you successfully conquered social media or things like that doesn't actually dictate the success for either a disinformation actor or for media literacy or educator or like fact-checking actor. And this kind of content, disinformation or misleading content, does rely on a variety of interactions where it's not just I go there, I remove, and we move on, but it relies on one party doing one thing so another party can do another thing because our digital system is much more interconnected. And so victory couldn't be stagnant. We needed actors to feel unique because how people engage in social media is varied depending on where they're interacting and who they're interacting with. And content needs to move not just in predefined ways, but find ways to pop up organically and or be grassroots created. And so I needed to find a model and a system for design that felt interconnected. And so I turned to ecosystems as kind of a model for thinking about disinformation networks. So not thinking about them as war zones or not thinking about them as viral loads and community spaces, but as an ecosystem where the influence of one actor changes what happens with another actor. So what we do when we're doing an ecosystem model is you have kind of media assemblages, right? So I mentioned actors and environments are interconnected. Content, the disinformation content, is just the glue. It doesn't actually matter what the content is, right? It just matters that it brings people together to interact. The goals shift. Each actor has their own goal. A platform moderator on Facebook only cares about protecting Facebook. They're not typically caring about protecting anyone else. Even on Facebook, that's too general. They're actually caring about their very particular group or groups on Facebook that they're in charge of managing, and everything else kind of gets pushed aside. Or certain disinformation actors are actively trying to, they're getting paid to share what they're doing, and others are just like, I want to troll people and annoy them today. And there's differences in how they interact and what they're doing. And finally, these diverse channels where we have to think about grassroots kind of popping up of disinformation content. So this is what led to kind of the final version of Lizards and Lies, which there's some, pretty images here of tokens and meeples and pieces to make it look like, it's actually a game, which it is. Where the game is focused on kind of this ecosystem style of approach. And what I like to say is kind of the final remarks on what this design process led to is that it's not just a disinformation war. But when we talk about making these tools that are simulating these digital spaces, there's a balance between thinking about who these tools are for, because citizens are on the front lines of disinformation attacks. And it's important that we create kind of games that allow these frontline defenders to actually recognize how these systems work. And so what Lizards and Lies does well from my experiences playtesting it and running it is it helps understand the environment, which is helpful for those who are becoming actors in terms of they're trying to deal with like their fact checkers or their moderators, but also for average citizens who are trying to figure out why am I seeing this content on my feed? Why is conspiracy kind of here and here and here and here? How does the system work? And so we can use these kind of models and systems to showcase that. So if I'm going to give you the research findings, which the talk today is more focused on the design side, but as a researcher, I can't help but provide some research findings, is that misleading content, the disinformation does move in that push and pull. In all of the simulations that were designed, this idea of like events really did showcase that bubbling up and swarming down. Single solutions, right? So the idea of a war ending in victory or defeat or a vaccination are ineffective for thinking about how we actually deal with this. When there's a disinformation movement, thinking of we have one answer to deal with disinformation is never the right play. Ecological models seem to offer a more effective comprehension of the interaction online. So thinking about our digital systems as ecosystems can be more helpful in that space. And game design offers ways to kind of explore and test media theory, which I think is less applicable for our interests today, but from some of the work that I do, it's an interesting finding. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to attempt to play a board game with you all on Zoom. So we're going to see how that goes. I unfortunately am not going to be able to give you a lot of agency and choice in this. Instead, what I'm going to do is like walk you through a round of the game so you can get an understanding for how a lot of those concepts for disinformation are baked into the cards, the actions, and environments that the game produces. So we're going to see how this works, and I apologize if it feels confusing because you're not actually able to play the game right now because it's all going to be digitally mediated, but I'm going to try my best to explain this and break it down for you so you have an understanding of how the game works. And if ever in the future you do want to play the game, I'm happy to help you figure out how to facilitate that, come to you to help facilitate that, or even Zoom a facilitation for it, which I've done in the past. So anyways. So this is the basic setup for the game, right? We have the game board. I can move. Fantastic. We have the game board here. I highlighted the tokens so you can hopefully make them out a bit more. So I have little lizards and little birds, which are meant to represent conspiratorial content. Remember before I said content doesn't matter in terms of what it is. So the bird just represents anything to do with the bird conspiracy of the game. And the lizard represents kind of any kind of discussion around the lizards of the game. And for example, for a breakdown, the two conspiracy theories are based off of real world ones, which is the lizard one is the idea that there are alien lizards taking over our planet and replacing our world leaders. This is not true. Please don't leave this talk thinking this is true. This is not true. And the other one is birds, which is actually a satirical movement called Birds Aren't Real, which was mocking conspiracy theories and talking about how birds have been replaced as government drones out of a factory in Mount Rushmore. Also not true. Please don't leave this thinking that is true. And so these are the two conspiracy theories, and again, they were chosen to make it more lighthearted, and they're represented as like these tokens, the birds and the lizards on the board. Then you'll also see these circles. They're meant to be magnifying glasses, but I think they're just cut off a little bit. Magnifying glasses with like 3 lines in it. These are moderators. They are the people on platforms who are making sure the content being posted on the platforms is okay. And finally, these little brains these little blue brains, are meant to represent critically aware users or people who have been taught media literacy skills and can hopefully fact check a bit for themselves. Those are kind of the basic tokens. You'll see that we have our networks of like Thoughtbook. I don't know if you can make that through the Zoom, but like it's Facebook wannabe, Shreddit or Reddit, TikTok or TikTok, MeTube or YouTube, and Chirper or Twitter, which now has changed in terms of naming and it should just be one letter. But alas, we are here. And so how the game works is you can play the game as is. However, because as you kind of looked at those models before, having a story does help ground what's happening. And so the game actually has a scenario that you can play through to help kind of drive it. I'm not going to read through the entire story today because I want to save you all eyes and time in this Zoom call today. But I will tell you there is a story. And what it does is it changes the board state, but also drives changes in the story based off what happens in the board. So the general story is based off an election where you have one political party that's kind of leaning into the conspiracy theory because it's helping them get votes, and another political party that's trying to kind of shove them away and talk about the political issues. And of course, that's quite a binary. But for the sake of the game, we stuck with it. There is, as you can see here, depending on the story, at the end of the story, there is a change to the board. And so in this case, we're adding some conspiracy theory to MeTube and Chirper, and we're adding more moderators there because there's kind of a social media discussion happening on those platforms where we're seeing kind of false information get thrown around. And so that's just me representing that. So I highlighted in a brighter color what that did, so you can hopefully see the changes when they happen. So more content was added to these platforms because there was a lot of discourse happening or conversation happening on these platforms, and then some content got flagged. And we'll worry about what these all mean and what they do as we play through the game together. So it's a turn-based game. You go one turn at a time, and we're going to start with the conspiracy theorists, who are the people trying to spread false information. Every character has a player board, which has some text on it, which is meant to kind of help break down some of the keywords they see on cards, provide some tips on how to play, and also just gives them what they do on their turn. And that's the most important thing, is we just follow the steps on the board. At the end of the day, the game is just do step 1, step 2, step 3, pass the turn. And so in this case, when you're playing conspiracy theorists, your goal is to build up little communities that you can then kind of grow out of. So their step 1 is to build support. So they're going to add a conspiracy theory token to any node that they control. So anywhere they have conspiracy tokens already. So in this case, they're going to add a bird over here in TikTok because there doesn't seem to be a lot of flags or people trying to remove their content. So they're going to go add a bird over here. That's step 1. Step 2, they get to play cards from their hand. There's 5 cards in their hands, and we're going to play just a few of them today because, again, we're on Zoom, so I don't know how well this translates. And we're going to just see how that goes. So the first card they're going to play is they're going to spread conspiracy. Very simple card, very direct. Cards at the top have like this bird on it, which is meant to represent which conspiracy theory it's spreading and which communities it can engage in. So in this case, you select engage. A lot of cards will say select on them if you play the game. Select is just referring to where you are making the action occur. So you're just selecting a place on the board for the rest of the card to occur. So you select somewhere there's already bird supporters hanging out, which we have some up here in the top left corner of the board. And we're going to add another bird there, and then we're going to add a bird to an adjacent connected community. So it's like a bunch of people are talking together and then they spread some posts to a nearby related community. That's card 1. Card 2 is they start to have a coordinated campaign. So they start to migrate their ideologies to another space because they want to make sure more people are aware that the birds are actually drones. So what this card is telling you to do is you choose 2 places where there are, conspiracy theorists that are supporting your theory, and they're going to migrate to different platforms or networks and add some birds there. So this card added some new conspiracy across the board. Then another card, they're going to just do the same thing again with lizards. So remember at the start, we added a bird because we spread 1 engaged and spread 1 connected. They're doing the same thing over here because they're trying to make sure they can fill up the board as much as possible. For the sake of time and the sake of making sure you don't have to read every single card in this game, I played out the rest of their turn for you, and they just added some more content to the board. And so at the end of the turn, you can already see, if I go back a few slides, right, the board at the start versus the board at the end has a lot more conspiracy on it, right? Thinking about that wave of that swarm bubbling up. And then we're going to move into the educators Oh, I'm going backwards. The educators who are next. And so once again, they have their own player board. And I'm not going to do all the breakdown here because it's not important for what we're trying to talk about today. But they're going to just go through the steps on their board. And their step one is actually very similar to the step one that the conspiracy theorists have, which is they get to add a critically aware token. So they're pretty much informing people in a network to be critically aware that some of these conspiracy theories aren't true. And so they're going to add right here a little brain in addition to what's already there. Then they're going to play cards from their hands. That's the typical step two for most characters. So the conspiracy theorists, their goal was to build up communities. Educators actually are trying to do a similar thing. They're trying to build up communities of resilient social media users. And what that means is they're teaching people content, but just because you teach people how to fact check, it doesn't actually mean they're going to fact check. So sometimes what happens when you play this game is the educators will teach a bunch of people, but then no one will actually remove the content because they're not actually fact checking, which actually happens in real life where people are like, they know how to fact check, they just don't bother. And so in this case, they're going to teach one as somewhere where they have one. So they just added another brain somewhere. Then they're going to play this card, which is to address the flappening or to deal with some of the birds that are there. So what they're going to do is they're going to choose a place where there's no no blue tokens, no critical thinkers, and at least one bird conspiracy token. They're going to teach someone there to critically see the lies of the conspiracy theory, and then critique. And critique is referencing to removing. So when you're being a critical thinker, you're critiquing and you're removing content. And so the idea here is that, you told someone, hey, guess what? This is a lie in this conspiracy theory. That person in that community was like, oh yeah, you're right. And they went in there and they were reporting the content and removed it. So over here, we removed a single bird and the board looks slightly better, but maybe not. But then we have this really exciting card called Create Discussion. And one of the things in the design standpoint is that, like I mentioned before, education, while helpful, struggles because if you don't actually engage and motivate people, it's not going to do anything. So a lot of the cards that the educator character has is like, if you have one critically aware token, if you have two critically aware tokens, or if you have three critically aware tokens. So the more people you have in a space who are critically aware of the fake news movement or the disinformation movement that exists, the more likely you're going to actually get responses. And so these cards have better payoffs if you play them where you have a lot more of your critically aware tokens. So in this case, if you have three of them, you're going to teach, so you're going to add one more, and then you're going to critique everywhere connected to it. So we chose this place here where we already had three. When you teach one and you critique connected, you're going to add one to all the connected. That's what those lines on the board are showing. All the connected, and you're going to remove content equal to the brains that are there, or the critically aware tokens that are there. I always refer to them as brains, which is actually less helpful if you've never played the game before, but the critically aware tokens that are there. And so that would be the end of their turn, because again, I fast forward to the end of their turn, where they just added a few more brains on the board, and you can see already that I'll do a larger look, but we've removed some of the bad content, right? But then the next player to go is the trolls or the edgelords. And trolls or edgelords, from the research and thing that we show, they're typically slightly more planned or they don't actually care about the content that they're doing. They're just there to get a reaction. And so their cards and their actions, unlike the others where you have step one, do a thing, step two, play cards in your hand, their cards kind of change their steps as they go. They start to adapt to where they want to target. And on their turn, they always select one location, and then they just do everything for the rest of their turn at that location. They're like, I'm going to find this community and I'm going to bother this community today, because that's typically what a troll will end up doing. And then their cards will make those steps on their player board slightly more powerful. So their step one is to select any node, but they play this card instead, which lets them select one node in. Yeah, I think my mic cut out. Can you hear me again? Okay. I had just mentioned that select one node in two different networks. You heard that, I think, right when it cut out? Okay, cool. Just making sure. So you choose different two locations. So in this case, we choose that we're going to add content here this turn, and we're going to mess with these two places this turn. Then you choose a theory. We like birds, so we're going to spread more conspiracy about the birds. That's your step two. Step three is you add one conspiracy token, or you can play a card to change that. I mentioned that all of them have powers, and I didn't want to break that down unless we're playing together. This is a lot of text because for some reason I could not find a way to make this clear with less text. But the short answer is that if you have two cards that are the same step, you just discard one and you repeat whichever card you played. So in this case, for step 3, we're going to add 3 conspiracy tokens to a community, and we'll discard the other step 3 card we have to do that twice. That's all it's telling us. So what would happen is we would add 3 tokens here and 3 tokens here. But one of the rules in the game that I haven't talked about yet is social media has kind of breaking points where once enough people start talking about content or enough people start engaging with content, the algorithm starts to take over and it kind of gets spread through social media because it's like, oh, all these people are talking about it. You probably want to see this too. And so every single community, every single circle that you see on this page, these nodes, once they have more than 4 conspiracy tokens on them, they will then spread to everything connected to them. So up here is the one right here. We were supposed to add 3, but that put us above 4. So when we added that 5th one, it instead added a bird conspiracy token to every single connected community. So all the communities around instead became kind of influenced by the content that was going on there because it became such a big conversation in that community. It bled out into other communities. An example actually from this week, I don't know how many people have been like prevalent on different social medias, but there was a showcasing of like aliens in Mexico. It were like showcasing bodies, and it was being talked about in small groups, and then like it blew up, and all of it seems to be quite false and misleading and incorrect content, but it's actually a really good example of like insular communities and then one kind of piece getting brought up and caught on and then growing and spreading from there, to show kind of how these algorithms spread and proliferate content throughout. Finally, there's step 4. They can choose one of these actions. Because at the start of their turn, they chose this location and this location. It happens twice, one in each location. And they can mark places as vulnerable or they can remove content. Making something vulnerable, this is a reference to the fact that in social media, sometimes there are communities that aren't actually spreading disinformation or they aren't actually spreading conspiracy theory. But if you were to post something to them that is conspiratorial or is disinformed, they're more likely to accept it. They're more likely to keep it around and not get rid of it. And so by consistently creating space for kind of these arguments and debates around these content, you can make some communities more vulnerable to future disinformation. So this little target token just means the next time conspiracy is added, we add an additional conspiracy token. It makes it more likely to grow and proliferate. So that's the end of their turn. And again, as you can see now, the board is once again really full of conspiracy theory, right? So we had that swarm bubble up, the swarm bubble down, and now it's bubbled back up again. And then we have the last turn of the round, which are our platform moderators. And platform moderators, they have a bit of a task of they're trying to flag content or find flag content and then address the flag content and remove the flag content. So how their character works is they have these little magnifying glasses which are meant to represent the moderators themselves, like people in those platforms checking content. And then they have those little flags, which I think is right now buried underneath the card, which you'll see in a second. But their step 1 is to add flags to networks. So they were going to flag where they think the problem is. Remember I mentioned before that idea of triaging systems? The ecosystem kind of relies on that push and pull of triaging kind of where do we actually have to focus our efforts and where do we not. Flagging content is a way that we can visualize that and we can engage in that, where they're saying, hey, look, there's a lot of conspiracy talk over here that doesn't seem true. Or, hey, look, there's a lot of conspiracy talk over here that doesn't seem true. Let's flag it so hopefully we can deal with it and address it moving forward. Because the problem that moderators have compared to disinformation proliferators is that to spread disinformation, you don't really have to care about what you're writing. To write a lie is so much quicker and faster than to actually write truth. Because to write truth, you have to provide, logic and reasoning and or some kind of citation or argumentation for it. And so to fact check or to moderate, you typically have to make sure that what you're actually removing is okay to remove. And that takes more time than just posting a lie onto a forum. And so the first thing they do is they flag content. Then like everyone else, they're going to play cards from their hand. So I mentioned before that when something builds up, it will spread to everything connected. The nice thing from a fact-checking perspective on that is when something like a fake news article becomes really popular and it spreads everywhere, it's also really easy to, once it's been disproven, find where it is and then kind of flag it consistently. So if you've ever been on like Facebook during COVID, you might have seen like gray banners on like certain posts or tweets that was like, this has been fact checked as false or misleading, and this is why. It's because once that post has officially been fact checked, all the posts like it that have the same kind of data signature are easy to follow. And so this fact checker over here was like, okay, a lot of these birds are incorrect and they're lying. So they're going to play this card where you can remove the flag because the content was flagged. And then you can remove 2 conspiracy from the token, from the network where you did it, and then 1 from everything connected. So it's kind of like the opposite of that spread that the trolls just did in their previous turn. It's like a way to counteract that, but also rely on that idea of fuzzy matching is the term that I think Meta actually uses to reference how their algorithms identify similar types of like problematic content on their feeds. So they remove it. Then they have this card that lets them move moderators. I mentioned before that like moderators is a job. You can get burnout. It's people doing these things. And so for content to get moved, you actually need a person to go there and look at it and examine it. I know that for like non-social media platforms, there's people's whose entire day job, or even on social media platforms, sorry, their entire day job is just they get a spreadsheet of logs that they have to go through one at a time and be like, this is true or this is false. And those logs are based off the different communities they're in charge of. And so if they're not looking at a certain community, it's not going to get addressed. So this card is just a way to move the fact checker tokens around, and that's what those arrows are showing in response to the card. Then we have fact checking. It's just a very simple card. You choose a place that has a moderator or fact checker, and you remove 2. Which I actually forgot to put the X's, but that happened down in the bottom right. I forgot to put the little X's on the PowerPoint. I apologize. And then finally, the last step that they have is anywhere there's a flag and a moderator, they can remove 2 conspiratorial pieces of content. And so this is very simple of like when content's been flagged and we go look at it, that's the easiest way for us to remove it. So that's how their turns always end. And so that would be the end of the moderator's turn. And once again, the board's looking a little bit less full. But what I want to show is kind of the transition across all 4 turns, because that's what the game is actually trying to show, is how one role impacts another role, which impacts another role, which impacts another role. So this was the start of the game. This was the end of the conspiracy theorist turn, right? We saw like a large proliferation, a large swarm kind of grow at the top. By the end of the educator's turn, a bunch of people were told that this isn't really true. And you saw some people within those communities be able to be like, guys, this isn't actually correct. Let's fix this and let's not follow this. Then you had the trolls come in and they spread it again. And so you see that swarm bubble up. But if you notice from the start to here, even when it's fact checked, there's some lingering content. Remember I mentioned that when that swarm recedes, there's still some things that stay. We're seeing that happen here. Then the edgelords add some more, and the fact checkers try to remove it. But every single time it gets removed, a good amount gets removed, but there's still at least 1 or 2 or 3 pieces of conspiracy content or people who are kind of engaging in this content that are still there. So the game would happen over a series of rounds, and the next round that this goes through, even more conspiracy can get added because there's already existing communities to grow off of. However, that's where I'm going to end the playtest and the presentation workshop conversation today, because I feel like that's been a lot of content and a lot of kind of material. And I do appreciate you bearing with me and being here with me today, because I hope that this was helpful and or interesting to you. And like I said before, if you want to play the game or you have questions about the game, it is free to print off and download. If you want to buy copies, I can send you a link for that as well. But also, if you're interested just in the design work that I'm doing or how I'm thinking about disinformation or even the research projects I'm on, I'm happy to talk more about any of this stuff.